Hello, it's a Flying Doctor here. I recently posted a message onto the Friends of Austin 7 forum regarding some work that I'd done to set up my lathe to do some grinding. Thought I'd make a little video to explain how that was done. Bear in mind that we're in lockdown at the moment in England due to the coronavirus, so I had to do this just with the bits and pieces I had lying about the house and in my scrap box, and the various tools that I had that I could reuse. So most important thing was I have this die grinder, which is a pneumatic one, which does mean that you've got to have a compressor to use with it, but anyway, I've got one, so that's not a problem. The rather nice thing about this is it's got this 3/4 inch diameter shaft here that you can mount or use to mount it. So what I did in my scrap box, I found a piece of 1 by 1.25 inch steel. By sticking it in the 3-jaw chuck in the lathe, I could actually bore an off-center hole through it, 3/4 inch in diameter. I also drilled and tapped some 6mm holes, cut a slot, and then on one side opened up those 6mm holes to be clearance, so that I could put some 6mm bolts in there, which would then clamp onto the die grinder. So by putting those 6mm Allen screws in, you can then slide it onto the die grinder, hold it in a particular position that you want, and tighten that up. Now, the other thing I needed to do, of course, was to be able to mount this onto the lathe. I've got this single tool post which fits onto the compound slide. 2 nice bolt holes in there that are used normally to clamp onto the tools. So what I was able to do here was just to use piece of scrap steel that I had, drill some holes in it at the appropriate places, 2 holes to be mounted via the holes in the tool post, and some washers and the bolts that normally clamp onto the tools. So that does that job. But then I also needed to be able to clamp onto the piece of metal I'm using to hold the die grinder, and I can just use the same 2 holes. The other thing what I did do though is to organise this so that when it's actually bolted up, the gap between the back of this and the tool post is pretty much, it's hard up against it, so that it gives it a bit more rigidity. What I did find when I first mounted it onto the lathe, that it was just that tiny bit high, the center of the die grinder to the center line of the lathe. So just a small shim cut and fitted underneath, sorted that out so that the center of the grind wheel is actually dead center with the center line of the lathe. So that's the way that just tighten this up a little bit. So you can tighten these down, tighten those down. You then slide your die grinder in and tighten these 2 clamp bolts. And that holds it really rigidly once it's mounted on, and obviously then you can stick your various little grind wheels in. The other thing I need to do is to manage to hold that thing so that it runs permanently when I haven't got hands to do it, and highly technical job of using a piece of cable tie that you can just slide over to hold it. So that was that job. Now the reason I wanted to to use this was because I wanted to do some reprofiling of my Austin 7 cam followers. This is one that this is one I've done. And basically the idea with this is to change the radius of the top of the cam follower from a 1/2 inch radius to a 3/4 inch radius. Now in my scrap box I also had some 1¼ inch steel bar. I bored a hole through that steel bar that would allow this to be mounted in. I obviously needed a way of clamping this. I've got a bolt in here. What I did with the bolt, you can see inside that the bolt's actually going to clamp on it. I've counterbored the end of the bolt and machined a little piece of aluminium that fits in there, so that when you when you tighten it up, it's going to hold it at right angles to the center line of the bar. The other thing I needed to do is to ensure that every time I put one of these things in, that it was going to be sticking up past the end of the, or past the diameter of this 1¼ bar by 1/8 inch plus 50 thou. So what I then did was to just machine a little bit of brass with an appropriate counterbore, that when it fits on and you screw the adjuster in, it's going to hold it at exactly the right height so that I can get reproducible grind on each one of these cam followers. The other things I wanted to do was to dress up some of the valves. The old valves, some of them had a bit bruising on the ends. I wanted to dress those up using also another little piece of 1¼ inch steel with a hole in the middle and a slot. Meant that I could actually put those into the lathe, put it in the chuck, and just face off the end and put a little chamfer on to take any burrs off. And obviously putting things in a 4-jaw chuck and actually using a dial gauge indicator to set these up, and with the die grinder set at 45 degrees I can actually dress these faces ready for lapping. I'm going to show you how the bits and pieces I made to use on the lathe actually fit on, and how it all works out. Because of the long die grinder I'm using, what I generally do is just drop the tailstock off the end of the lathe. So the next thing is just to remove the 4-way tool post. Just wind this back a little bit, and then this is the setup with the die grinder and the single tool post. So that just fits straight on to there. Okay. So then generally you put the airline onto there to run up the die grinder. When I'm doing the grinding, refacing of the or reprofiling of the cam followers, as I mentioned in my earlier video, this basically what happens is that this little jig that I made just fits into the 3-jaw chuck like so. The spacer on the end ensures that the cam follower is actually in exactly the right position, and then all you do is to tighten up the nut on the end. So just give that a little nip. That holds the cam follower in exactly the right position, and just wind in this. Bear in mind that this sets this cam follower up to be 1/8 plus 50 thou beyond the outside of this 1¼ inch jig, and all you basically do is to move this backwards and forwards with the die grinder running, and just wind the saddle backwards and forwards until you've got it down to the right level. What I normally do is then just check the height there, so we want to bring that down to exactly 1/8 from the jig to the top of the cam follower. So that's how they were done. When it comes to dressing valves, even simpler job. To dress the end of the valve, just place it in this little jig that I've got here. That allows me to then clamp that into the 3-jaw chuck. So what we then need to do is to turn the die grind around so that we can get access to the end of the valve. Just rotate this one through 90 degrees. Die grinder then goes in that way. So that would be in there. You can then actually run the lathe and then just run the grind wheel back and forth across the end of the valve to dress the end of the valve up. And I then just used a very fine file just to take any burrs off the edge, or stone indeed. So when it comes to dressing the sealing faces of the valve, slightly more awkward, because what I have to do is just to move the position of the compound slide to a different locating position a little bit further this way. I've got a couple of positions on here that you can mount the compound slide. Screwdriver. Just take this plug out. Fits on there. Die grinder fits through there. So when I'm doing this, normally I've got the 3-jaw chuck on here, but normally I'd always put the 4-jaw chuck in, use a dial gauge indicator to make absolutely sure that the valve is running true, and then you can simply run the lathe at a fairly low speed, and you can dress the face of the valve. Simple as that. Okay, that's it for now. I hope that was useful.